so let me just find a good way to balance things, because I had a couple handouts that I wanted to show people that are in the back. So again, my name is Raina Rippel, and I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank the group for doing such an amazing job pulling all of us together. I had a great time meeting some of my fellow presenters last night. So I'm just going to jump right into it. I know we're going to make up for a little bit of lost time. So one of the things I wanted to start out by saying is shale gas, the situation with shale gas, I think, changes every day, literally every day. So at dinner last night, I started looking up an article, and I thought, I want to send this person that I just met to this researcher out of Yale. Started paging through my articles, and I said, oh my gosh, there was a derailment in Timnath, Colorado, frac sand by an elementary school, which hits home. I mean, this really hits home for us, right? So those of us who are living in these areas, we see the impacts. Thank goodness it was not a rail car full of toxic chemicals, but the frac sand has toxic properties that can cause silicosis. I think we have a much greater understanding of the risks. And the other thing that I was going to start by saying is, looking at the different news that has come out just over the last week, and even just in the past couple days, I started preparing my remarks shortly before I came because I really wanted to know what was new and what had just happened. We had a pipeline explosion near Pittsburgh about a week and a half ago, somebody who is still in the hospital. I don't know if all of you know about this, but that was actually over a gas storage facility, which could have been as big as 35 miles. So imagine a pipeline explosion getting into a gas storage facility that's 35 miles. That is a massive, massive, massive emergency, terrifying scenario. It's very, very bad for the one person whose house was essentially decimated by this. So we have a far greater understanding of the risks. I know that Lee was just saying 4 years ago, we were all together. About 3 years ago, I remember standing in front of an audience and saying, the health impacts are real. And people were saying, are they not? And they are, and we know that now. So I'm going to take us through some of what we found. I think all of us here today have a fairly good understanding of the industry. There's some slides that I'm going to have at the beginning which show some of the different processes, but what I wanted to point out in those is the specific chemical emissions and some of the health effects that are associated with those different processes. Because this is a very sprawling industry, it's big, right? It's pipelines. New York is not immune to this. None of the states in New England who say we don't have gas drilling. Ohio is right there with us in Pennsylvania, right? So we've got Utica, we've got Marcellus, we've got some serious problems. And I think that the science has done an amazing job of getting us to understanding that, but the science is so far behind where we need to be, given the industrial build-out that has occurred. So at EHP, we're really striving to understand the health impacts. So just going to give a few facts about, not so much about the industry, but really about the stages of development and how those are connected to the health effects that we have seen and that we have documented. And just explain a little bit about EHP. So again, we were formed in 2011, really when gas drilling was hitting Pennsylvania pretty hard from the Marcellus. And I looked around and I had some colleagues in public health and we were saying, where's the health message here? And policymakers, in fact our governor at the time, wouldn't touch it, right? Would not touch it with a 10-foot pole. When health questions came up, I saw him in public, just absolutely skip past them. And I thought, okay, here's a weakness. We need to really address what are the health impacts. We really need to understand this as this industrial build-out is occurring in our region. So this is our mission, but I think the most important part of this mission is timely. So as this build-out has occurred, health impacts are coming fast and furious. People do not understand them. I have so much respect for the medical profession, but environmental health training is not front and center in most medical providers' training. So I do not expect the majority of physicians to diagnose things from environmental health concerns. It's just not in their training. So they're learning as we're learning. And I have a long history with Physicians for Social Responsibility and working with healthcare providers on medical education. They're not gods. They do need to learn. They do need to be educated. And they want to do the right thing, right? They want to protect your health. But they may not understand what you're being exposed to. So that's really a lot of my background is trying to get the medical community to speak out, to say what they know, to know what their client population is experiencing, their patients, and then from a public health model, to put tools in the hands of the people who are impacted and say, here's how you protect yourself. Here's what you do in the short term. The science is going to catch up. The medical community is going to catch up. But here are some things you can do to protect yourself. So, again, New York, not immune from this. We do some work in New York. We have done some work in Ohio. Most of our work has focused in southwestern Pennsylvania, and we have done some in northeastern Pennsylvania. We're also talking to some communities out in California who are experiencing some of the oil, and we've talked to Colorado, all the different groups. I actually talked to a guy in Timnath, Colorado, so we're pretty plugged in. And New England has had, just going to do a shout out to some success there where they actually have stopped some of the pipeline expansion. So a lot of the New England communities were coming to us and saying, we're very concerned about compressor stations, we're very concerned about pipeline expansion, and they had a couple of victories and they have gone away. So that's great, congratulations. But Pennsylvania and Ohio, West Virginia, we're in the thick of this. So I'm going to take you through it. I'm going to do this fairly quickly because I want to focus on the health effects. But I just wanted to point out some of these different industrial processes, and I'm guessing almost everyone here knows this thoroughly. So again, I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but I just wanted to point out a couple different things, on-site activities, what the health effects we see are, and then some of the off-site activities. So on-site, again, most everybody knows this, truck transport. I think one of the things that people need to understand more is that just the quality of life, just the traffic, if there was no other science around this, if there was no other understanding of this, truck traffic is ruining these bucolic agricultural communities. And there have been some horror stories, some awful, awful stories about accidents, people getting killed. It's a really, really, really serious effect. And nobody can deny this. Nobody can look around and say, no, I'm not so sure that the benzene levels are at that level. No, the truck traffic is there. Thousands of truck trips in these small communities. That's a serious problem. And I think in parts of Ohio it's very serious. But in West Virginia, some parts of Pennsylvania where you've got these small, windy roads, that's a very serious problem. There's a lot of potential for accidents, which wasn't there before. But we're starting to understand also these VOCs, diesel fumes, and you'll see particulate matter pretty much everywhere. Again, casing drilling, hydraulic fracturing. So this is just a quick run through of some of the concerns that we have in terms of health effects. And at the bottom, you'll see volatile organic compounds, VOCs, the silica dust, the diesel, and the particulate matter. We're starting to really pull apart in a very targeted fashion with not a comprehensive epidemiological mass data set, but we're starting to really look closely at the data from a health perspective and say, when that process is happening, this health effect occurs, and it occurs when, for instance, there's more production. So the more production actually on a well pad, the more health effects. So if you have a well pad that's not producing as much gas, you're not going to have as many health effects. This is early stages. The science and what we do really is a lot of hypothesis generating and say, here's something that we're observing. Somebody really needs to look into that. At the same time, this public health experiment is going full bore, and so what can we do, again, to bring to the populations who are exposed and say, here's your emission, here's what you can do to protect yourself. Flaring, again, this is a time when you see a lot of health effects. So literally, if and when they're flaring, acute health effects appear to be spiking associated with that. Condensate tanks, this is more of a longer-term infrastructure. We've got VOCs, methane and ethane. The flowback, impoundment, have some concerns about H2S, the hydrogen sulfide, and of course spills, accidents, things like that impacting the groundwater and the drinking water. And this is really the last. This shows the completion of the well, just this cute little Christmas tree, not a problem, right? But there's some VOCs still coming off of that. So now you go past the well pad and you say, what are the things that are actually the wider infrastructure that are still hitting people? We do have some concerns about the pipelines. Clearly there's concerns about accidents and explosions with pipelines, no doubt about that. But then also these compressor stations, and again, this is where we've done some of our work in New York, where we've been looking at the emissions around the compressor stations. And New York is in the blissful condition where you don't have anything else necessarily. You have the pipelines and you have the compressor stations, but you don't have all of that other background noise that we see here in Ohio and that we see in Pennsylvania, and even definitely in southwestern Pennsylvania, but also in northeastern Pennsylvania. So just briefly, I mean, again, everybody probably knows this is what a pipeline looks like. Lots of clearing, lots of disruption of the ecosystem. But some of the things that I think people don't fully understand is what's being emitted out of that pipeline. Is it a pipeline that's not compromised? Is it leaking? And my favorite thing, a pig launcher. I'll show you that in a minute. Compressor stations. These compressor stations, and this is what I think is very important for people to understand. There's been a lot of industry communications that say this is just a temporary thing, it's a well pad, it's going to be gone in a year, it's going to be gone in 6 months. Compressor stations are going to be around for 20 years, right? So to the extent that we're starting to really see a lot of emissions and health effects from compressor stations, that's going to last for 20 years. Those are some serious health effects and serious emissions, and that is not a temporary thing. That is not 6 months. That is not a year. That's going to be around for a long time, and there's going to be, I think, a fair amount of health effects from this. So again, volatile organic compounds, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter is just ubiquitous across the industry. It's showing up everywhere, and I think as the science starts to catch up and we start to see more information and more health studies that say particulate matter causes these serious health impacts, right? Cardiovascular. It may even be impacting people's stress. You know, we're really starting to unpack this and explore this. At the same time, the industrial infrastructure is just going full bore, right? There's no pause button. There's no stepping back. There's no saying, well, you know, these health effects, we understand them now, so let's hold off. It's just people need to wake up. So processing plants, this is something that definitely has been an issue in our area because we're trying to separate out some of the chemicals in the wet gas. And of course, here in Ohio, I should have added a slide where you've got the injection wells, right? And you've got the possibility of earthquakes. My extended family is actually from Kansas, and I get stories almost on a weekly basis about earthquakes. And I think, wow, that just never used to happen. Metering stations. This is something actually I think a lot of people overlook. The metering stations are, again, long-term infrastructure. It's something that's on the pipeline, and it's actually, we think, emitting a fair amount of VOCs. So it's the similar pollutants to the compressor stations, but there's a lot of these things, too, which I think is very important for people to understand. It's an intentional release, right? So this is not an accidental thing that's happening. These metering stations and a lot of these facilities are designed to let off pressure, essentially. So they have to, at least in the way the industry is behaving now, they have to let this pressure off the pipelines, they have to meter it, and so there's going to be these intentional releases that are really built into the system as it is today. And those releases, if you're pretty close to one of these metering stations, again, this is longer term infrastructure, there's some significant health concerns there. Pig launcher. Really, literally, they're launching these things called pigs through the lines. And again, this is something that I think is really important for people to understand. When they do something like that, all of a sudden you get this, compressor stations have these things called blowdowns. You know, you may get something that's a spike. And these exposures tend to be episodic in nature. You start to get these really acute health symptoms associated with something like, you know, sending the pig through, or these compressor station blowdowns. So it's not what the EPA regulates, where it's a flat line, where it's like, okay, 24/7, you know, it's like this, and the levels never went too high. It's like this spike, health effects, down, and then it stabilizes. But the EPA, like, averages it all out so that you never see that spike. And that spike is when the health effects appear to be happening. So I think it's really, again, important to understand the infrastructure and understand these different processes, because that's where the health effects appear to be coming. So, on to health concerns. Sorry, I wish I could be the, like, positive, you know, cheery, wake up, this is a great day. But I don't get to do that, so health concerns. And I'm going to punt to Kathy, Dr. Nolan, on health effects, on public health. Just a brief thing, which this is taken from a tour that we've been doing out in our community. Some people don't maybe fully understand what is public health. And I think that there's the very traditional form of public health, which is infectious disease. You've got the Zika virus. You're saying, you know, there's a food outbreak. What do we do to address that? And so there's the public health response. The public health response applies in this case, too, where you can look at this. You can say, what's the exposure? How do we break the pathway of exposure? How do we put tools in the hands of residents to really gain control over the situation they're in? And ultimately, I think this is in my next slide. Well, it's in this one. Prevent problems from happening. So that, I think, is the key thing here that we're looking at. And from a liability perspective, I wrote up my intro and I posed a couple of questions as Lee was referring to. How close is too close? What do we do from a liability perspective? You know, there's a slight industry downturn now, but is this going to last? Is this 5 years from now going to be a different landscape? Yes, absolutely. What are we going to do? Did we prevent these problems from happening? No, we did not. What is Ohio going to do as a state when the industry walks away? And we had a lot of conversations last night over dinner about what I like to call a tumbleweed industry. They come in, they blaze into town, they're cowboys, they frack you up, and then they leave, right? They're not invested. They're not going to stick around. However, compressor stations are going to stick around. The pipelines are going to stick around. But the fracking companies themselves, they're not here for the long haul. And I think from a public health perspective, and EHP really functions within that model, we try to be very preventive. We try to advocate for things like the precautionary principle. This flies in the face of that. This is the antithesis of the precautionary principle. This is, you know, drill, baby, drill. Take your lumps and walk away, and somebody else is left to pick up the pieces. And it's all of us who live in these communities. We're here for the long haul. I've talked to people who have said, for example, my name is Mrs. Smith, and I live on Smith Road. Where am I going to go? This is where my family has lived for generations. Why should I have to leave? You know, why should I have to pick up? Because this industry rolled into town, destroyed my community, and is ready to walk away. That is not right on so many levels. So again, we're really focused on health. I tend to skirt around the policy issues. I try and stay focused on health, but it's hard to not look at this from a policy perspective and say, are we protecting the public health? No. Are our regulators and our agencies doing the right thing for us? I can testify in terms of Pennsylvania. No. We do not have the protections in place to handle this industry. We do not have the protections in place. I'm a huge fan of zoning. I love zoning. I cut my teeth on zoning. Zoning was made to protect us. Zoning is out the window with this industry. That's primary public health. That's something we should all understand. You zone, you keep certain industrial infrastructure out of residential neighborhoods. The gas industry basically said, to do what we have to do, we need to be anywhere and everywhere, and that doesn't work, right? That's not going to be protective of the public health. So let me fast forward a little bit. So we're really starting to look at, again, the patterns, the symptoms. We consider ourselves really doing hypothesis generating, right? So we're trying to pave the way for some of our esteemed colleagues in the science and the medical community to really pick up and say, okay, yes, here's something that's an interesting finding. Let's explore that a lot deeper and really get a grasp. And at the same time, from a public health perspective, again, we have to put tools in the hands of impacted people and just make sure, just want to do a quick time check, make sure we're doing the right thing. So let me speed up a little bit. So again, this is similar to an outbreak investigation. If you had like food contamination, you would start to look at those things, and there's tools that you can put in people's hands. There's a lot that we know. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly here because I know a lot of the other speakers are going to talk about emissions, talk about their research. But there's, again, a lot of these things. They're happening on-site, they're happening off-site. And what do we know about our health? Brief exposures, precipitating symptoms. If there was one thing I could really enforce and leave in your heads today, it's, again, these spikes, right? So you get a spike, and you get these symptoms. And so it's not this gradual thing, and that, I think, is one of the challenges for the medical community, because it's not at occupational levels necessarily. It's this low-level, reoccurring, episodic spikes that are causing these health symptoms. So it's not something you can average out over 24 hours. It's not something you can look. It's not a one-shot thing. It's not, it happened once. It's happening again and again and again, but it's happening at relatively low levels. And that, I think, is where the health effects are coming from. I'll just hold this up real quick, and I have some copies of this on the back table. But this is something, this is not exactly that, but that's just the health issues in the literature. But I would recommend for people to take this. This really looks at the toxics, and it starts to, sorry, that's not it, but it starts to detail out what the different toxic emissions are and what the symptoms are that we're seeing associated with those toxics. So again, this is on the back table back there. But as this slide points out, there's a growing body of evidence. There's a lot more understanding at this point, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years into it, 10 years, however long it's been happening in certain areas, we understand it at a much deeper level. That doesn't seem to be translating into a policy change, but there, trust me, is a lot more understanding. And there's a lot of consensus now at this point in time. It kind of reminds me of climate change, where we look around and we say, yes, it's happening, right? I think that there's a fair amount of consensus now that says, yes, these health effects are happening. And again, this is where we start to look at particulate matter, PM2.5. The more PM2.5 we are seeing, and this again is just hypothesis generating, but the more PM2.5, the more symptoms we're seeing. So we're trying to explore these correlations. We're trying to really figure out, specifically for the communities who are impacted, how can you cut off these pathways of exposure? How can you protect yourself? How can you decrease the number of symptoms? We know they're there, right? We know you're being exposed, and as much as I would like to say, let's get out ahead on the issue, let's have a moratorium, it's not happening. The horse is out of the barn. Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, we've embraced this. What can we do to protect people in the situation we're in? So this is going to start to, forgive me, drill down a little bit more into the symptoms and what we're seeing. The closer you are, and this is where some of our recent findings have been looking at setback distances, there is some evidence that the closer you are, the more health symptoms you get. So while setbacks are not necessarily the answer for being fully health protective, they could help. Sorry to say this, but your setback distances in Ohio are laughable. They're so not health protective. I mean, you just have some setback distances, which I shake my head, literally, and I say, that's nothing. That's laughable. I mean, it just is so close. And if you start to look at half a mile, it's better, right? It's not great, but it's better. The more you can push this away from these residents, the better off you are. But it's tricky because as we started to explore this and try and work with the scientific community to get some answers, we said, well, you know, what should be an appropriate setback distance, for instance, for vulnerable populations? Well, do we take all of our pregnant women and keep them in a hospital and never let them out? No, we should, but, you know, I've been pregnant, so I know I should be quarantined. But that's not where the vulnerable populations are. They're not in one specific location during whatever vulnerable stage of life, elderly, pregnant women, children, they're dispersed. So how does a setback distance appropriately work for all of these dispersed vulnerable populations? The answer is it probably doesn't. So again, there's some, I don't have this handout, but some of that is similar to this. We're starting to really see certain symptoms, and these are the systems affected in our client population. So we've done our best to really drill down, I can't resist, but focus in on this population and try and weed out these kind of confounding factors and say, who are the people who had the onset of these symptoms in association with the industry or with the industrial development? They're close to a well pad, they're close to a compressor station, they're on public water versus private water. What do the symptoms look like? And these are the numbers that we're starting to see. So again, this is a small population, but I think that this is something which from a public health perspective, you know, it's basically a case study. These are numbers that can really start to inform what it is that people are experiencing and start to identify where are the emissions of concern, where are the exposures of concern. Again, frequently reported symptoms. Why are these occurring? That's what we're trying to figure out. And I think there's a lot of research to be done, unfortunately. It would be nice for us to put the pause button on again and say, hang on, this is a lot of symptoms, this is a lot of problems. Is it stress? It would be nice for us to really understand that before we move forward, but there we are. We're in the thick of this, and it's an experiment in the worst way. And I talk to a lot of people in the community, and I've heard this time and time again. People are sick of being experimented on. They're tired of being lab rats, as they say. And so it's hard from a scientific perspective, even from a medical perspective, to stand back and, having lived in this community, to dispassionately say, well, let's study this for 10 more years, right? Let's do this long-term study. It has to happen. We have to have those figures, unfortunately. Asbestos, lead, these are problems that, you know, people understood for a long time before the policies and the changes took place, and I am just sincerely sorry to say that sometimes you have to have the science. But public opinion can push a lot. So I think that as people have a greater understanding of the health effects and of the concerns, there may be some room there for us to do the science, understand this medically, but we've also got to make some really tough decisions. And I think that this is absolutely where Ohio's at, because 10 years down the line, are we going to look back and say, yeah, it was a public health experiment, and we let it happen? And I don't think that's appropriate. So some of the things we're observing. You know, it's not just one thing. It's not just benzene. It's not just the BTEX compounds. It may, in some cases, be the H2S, the hydrogen sulfide. Every place is unique. Every place is different. We're seeing a lot of difference in topography and weather patterns. And these are all things that, again, we really have to take into account, because different health effects, different symptoms are occurring in different different locations based on different chemicals. I think, however, it's going to be hard to get legislators and lawmakers and regulators to fully understand this. Again, I think there's a lot of room for public opinion and concerns to say, yes, we know there's an emission source. We see the health symptoms. We have to do something to address this. At the same time, we have to have a greater understanding. And there's a bit of a silver lining to this cloud. We have to have a greater understanding of what we're being affected by. And I see a lot of action of people doing their own low-cost monitoring, of people taking matters into their own hands and saying, okay, the regulatory agencies are not there with us. We're going to protect ourselves, right? We're going to figure out what we're being exposed to. That's really great, but it's not really the way we would think the world should work. It is what it is. So, again, we're starting to see a lot of, and I'm just going to kind of go through some of this quickly, but seeing some of the symptoms showing up with other symptoms. Why is that happening? What are the exposures that tend to be happening? Again, I cannot emphasize enough the quality of life issues, the disruption, the stress. Do not for a minute think that stress is not affecting a physical symptom. So it's all in your head, right? It's not. Your head's in your body, right? This is all one system. And what I'm experiencing, if I don't sleep for a couple of years, is not good health, right? So that is not something that is promoting good health. Stress, I hate to say it this way, but stress kills, right? So stress is impacting your body system. So if you are having some of this sleep loss, headaches, the stress, that's really dragging your physical system down. And we should really acknowledge that and deal with that. Nose and throat symptoms, again, we're seeing a lot of these things in association with other symptoms. Why is that happening? I mean, we're really looking at the scientific community and we're trying to piece this out. Sorry, I should hold this thing up too. We're having a conference in a couple weeks, Health and Shale Gas Development, State of the Science, and I encourage you all to come. There's a much, much broader and deeper understanding of what the medical impacts are. That's not the full solution. That's not going to give everybody all the answers they want and need, but it's helping educate the medical community who can then really speak out, address their patient concerns, and hopefully this will, in the Physicians for Social Responsibility model, lead to policy and lead to some action on this issue. In the meantime, we're just doing our best to understand what is it that people are, again, experiencing, how can we cut off these pathways of exposures, what do the symptoms look like, where do we think they're coming from? Well pads and compressor stations, again, you've got multiple exposure pathways. They're not equal, but they're certainly both impacting people's health and their health symptoms. What does it mean when you have the gas well and a compressor station? What do the symptoms look like there? Does the type of water you drink affect your health? Yes, we think so. So if you are on city water, your health effects and your symptoms appear to look different than if you're on drinking water, groundwater, water wells. So Pennsylvania is in not an entirely unique situation, but we have very little regulation of water wells, private water wells. I'm not certain actually about your situation in Ohio, but there's different exposures that appear to be occurring if you have private water wells versus city water. And again, vulnerable populations. Vulnerable populations are all of us, right? We're all vulnerable at some level. Certain populations are more vulnerable. So Pennsylvania and Ohio too has a burden of a lot of people with pre-existing and chronic diseases. You've got COPD. You've got a lot of legacy black lung type things, a lot of respiratory issues to begin with. This puts an even heavier burden on those populations. Pregnant women, children, a lot of our materials in the back there are focused on children. What's happening even at the fetal level? And I think that that's some of the most disturbing to me research is looking at the endocrine disruptors, looking at, really what is happening at almost the genetic level and at the fetal level to our health. And it's not positive. It's not very encouraging. So there should be more protection of these vulnerable populations, but again, they're dispersed throughout our population, so it needs to be comprehensive, our protection somehow. So again, we focus really on the public health, and we do our best to say, here's the tool, here's what you can do. We understand the policies need to change. In the meantime, what are your resources, right? What can you do as an impacted community resident? Can you monitor? Can you try and get away? I can't say enough for certain filtration units, but it's not the full answer, and a lot of people are saying, I don't have the money, I don't have the resources, I can't move, I'm here. And one of the things that kind of breaks my heart is people who live in these rural communities, their quality of life was a rural quality of life. So they moved to this community. They said, I want to be healthy, I want to be outdoors, I want to have an active lifestyle. What if you can't do that anymore? What if you can't feel safe going outside? How is that affecting your health? You're not as physically active anymore, you're not getting fresh air, even just opening the windows at night and letting the cool night air in. Do you feel safe doing that? Imagine the stress if you don't. This is a tremendous burden that's being placed on these rural communities. And some suburban communities, even in the case of California, some urban communities. It's somewhat tragic, but it's not something that a lot of people see necessarily. So you can see Columbus, you're here, you're looking around, you see the trees. Even if you're traveling around southwestern Pennsylvania in full summer, you don't see it, right? There's a lot of people, I think, who, as some people said, willful ignorance, but it's easy to miss. And I think that we here have a very deep understanding of the problems, but we have to understand a lot of people either do not want to see it or they don't see it. They don't fully understand it. So, here's a plea to get more people to understand there are some serious health problems associated with natural gas drilling. Understand that. You may not see it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Okay, and I'm not the mental health expert, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but as I said, again, effects of stress on our bodies, you've got these chemical exposures, you've also got non-chemical exposures, and it's the rapid change of these communities. I made this remark in a community presentation the other day, this is stressful, right? You see these kind of things, that's not a comfortable environment to be living in. It was kind of exciting at first. The first time I saw a flare, I thought, hey, wow, cool, look at that. And we took a small child with us and put on sunglasses and watched it. This was about 10 years ago. So I had no idea, right? I had no idea of the exposure that we were walking into because we thought, oh. And now I look at it and I think, this just, it eats away at me, right? So the stress of seeing this on a regular basis in your community is just really difficult. So these are kind of the kinds of things we're seeing in terms of stress. Again, we're really trying to say, what are the tools you can take? What are the things that you can do to help you? And we've got a lot of these handouts on our newly improved website, so I really encourage people to go and check that out. And we're trying to develop these resource guides so we can really understand where do you go for answers? How do you protect your health? What can you do? Because to the extent that we can give people tools, we hope that their stress and anxiety levels will get better. And that's what we've heard from doing some focus groups in the community. People have said, we really want to know the answers. We really want to know where to turn and what to do. Again, we're having our conference that's coming up. There's some flyers and registration materials on the back table there, but there will also be a breakout session on mental health, and really encourage people to attend. It's at the Pittsburgh airport, fly in, fly out, really easy. If you can make it over, it's a fairly quick drive over too. So moving forward, again, I said, precautionary principle, that's what we'd like to see happening. That is absolutely not what we're seeing happening. So what do you do in the meantime? How do you get people to protect their health? What are the tools that you can do? And we've got a lot of air monitors. We've got a lot of different water monitoring techniques that people can take. The health impacts are real, right? And I keep trying to emphasize this as people walk through the room and maybe hear or don't hear. We really do have a problem here with the natural gas drilling. And I think that the public health tools are something that can assist in the short term. We need some answers. I'm confident that some of the other speakers are going to provide some of the questions, and I hope a lot of the answers. My heart is going out to Ohio because we're right there with you in Pennsylvania. We have so many of the same challenges, and we hope to make it better. This is our team. I've got really pretty amazing team that I work with. And again, there's a lot of public health professionals, a lot of medical professionals. If you have any questions, health-related, please seek us out. We're happy to help. And this is our website. So, do I have time for questions?